And if you didn't get a handout, there is a handout in the back on, as you walk in, it'll be on your right. And there's three different sections there. So if you're missing one of the handouts, they are, there's a few left from the weeks before. So feel free to help yourself there if you haven't gotten those. We're on page 19. And we left off in talking about the nature of truth. And we could spend a lot of time talking about the nature of truth in various ways and in various terms. There are classes in various schools that deal at looking into truth in a deeper way. If you have a chance of sitting in a class like Brother Eddie's in hermeneutics, would help you in reading and understanding the Bible and applying it correctly. And this is the science of biblical interpretation, hermeneutics is. And so it's really a deep dive on biblical truth. There's also classes, logic in the Bible, and other classes that various schools offer where you can dig in and look at how we can analyze argumentation, how we look at rhetoric, how we look at truth statements and things of that nature, how we rule out in language and making sure our arguments are precise and making sure that they're sound and that they're valid, how to use persuasion. So there's a lot that can go into writing and making speeches and things of that nature that really deal with digging into truth. And so we are taking really a small glimpse tonight, but I feel like these things are important as we examine what the Bible teaches in regards to these things. So we left off talking about the nature of truth and time. There is an immediate aspect to it. There is also a past aspect to truth. And in the grammar, especially in the Greek grammar, some of these elements of time do come out, depending on what Greek word you're looking at and the way that each of those words are declined, whether it's a verb, whether it's a participle, whether it's an adjective or an adverb. These are the English descriptives that we use. Of course, Greek has their own way, but there is an element to the Greek language where you can get some sense of time, which is beautiful because the language is so precise. Truth also is prospective. In other words, there are things that will come to pass in the future. They haven't come to pass yet, but they will come to pass. So if we were to take at the bottom of page 19 and look at the different aspects of truth, truth is discovered. It's transcultural. In other words, there's truth for all people in all places. There is absolute truth that is objective and unchanging. So beliefs may change in response to truth, but truth itself does not change. Beliefs cannot change a fact. Dearly holding on to a belief does not somehow validate that belief. And so people can be sincere, but sincerely mistaken, or they can be sincere, but unaware. Maybe they've never heard the truth on a particular matter. And so we have the opportunity. You think about Apollos in the scriptures, you know, he was taken aside and taught the way of the Lord more perfectly. Lydia was down by a river in Philippi praying, and here Paul came along and found them, taught her the truth more perfectly. And we could look at other examples as well. And so all truths are absolute truth as revealed by God. And so in summary, page 20, truth can be known, it can be tested, it can be chosen, it can be persuasive, it can relate to time, it can be prescriptive. That means truth can tell us what ought to be. It can be proscriptive. It can tell us what ought not to be, what things are prohibited. Truth can be certain. It can be unrevealed. It can be revealed. And it can be hidden. And so all of these descriptives describe the nature of truth in the Bible. When we talk about the absolute view of truth, we're saying that truth can be known and that it's logically sustainable. And so it's able to withstand objections. And so what this does not mean, in other words, sometimes we ask questions about, you know, the absolute nature of truth and whether is this true for all places and all people and at all times. And so, you know, we may talk about the inherent aspect of truth or whether this truth is instrumental in nature. So how do we know the difference? And so in hermeneutics, you get into looking at various statements in the scripture. There was a group of people that met in the upper room. And so does that mean that we are supposed to meet in an upper room? And, so you look at certain elements in a passage, and how do you make the decision? Is there a principle here that I can glean some understanding? Not everything that the Bible describes is to be emulated, right? What I mean is, Noah was told to build an ark. So here is a factual statement, he was to make it of gopher wood. And because Noah was told to, should we therefore conclude, well, I need to build an ark? That would be, in hermeneutics, you could get into. So truth is absolute. So when we say that truth is absolute, what it doesn't mean is that we know everything like God does. We don't know everything like God. It doesn't mean that we know truth exhaustively. It doesn't mean that truth is always easy to discern. I may have difficulty getting to the bottom of a matter. I may need some help. And it doesn't mean that truth cannot be messy and even incredibly painful to follow the truth. And so these are things that we need to think about. But truth is absolute. It is objective. And as the Bible, as it's given to us, is an objective, absolute truth in its totality. So another aspect of truth is looking at truth and certainty. So everything is not speculative. We live in a world where postmodernism reigns. And you look at authority in America and in Europe, other places, and there is a constant challenging of authority. And so, people will sometimes, in an era of social media, what you see often is, a flattening of the plane in terms of voices, and voices that are experts in certain fields, right? And so, here's this age of the meme, age of the tweet. And so what you see in the social media arena is, we need to listen to everybody, and we need to listen to everybody's opinion matters. Everybody's opinion is important. Well, is that true? What if your opinion goes at odds and actually increases harm in other people's lives, right? So, Hitler had an opinion, right? Joseph Stalin had an opinion. Like their ideas and their beliefs were not without consequence. And so we don't live in a world where everything is speculative. If you go to the bank and your banker has an opinion about your deposits that it's different than yours, you probably don't want to do business there, right? If you have a math teacher and you're taking a math exam and you solve the problem and you show your work like the professor asked, and you have the right answer, you don't want a teacher that says, well, I'll give you partial credit. Right? If you've done the work and you've arrived at the right answer, everything is not speculative. And so in a postmodern era, everybody, the notion is popular in our society that people create their own truths, they create their own realities. There's no objective standard that evaluates right and wrong and things of that nature. And so certainty entails persuasion, it entails knowledge, it entails conviction. You look at these passages in Luke and Acts, and you could see as Luke would write to Theophilus, he would write to him that he could have certainty concerning the things that were taught. So Luke chapter 1 and verse 4, and then in the continuation in Acts chapter 2, let all the house of Israel therefore know for certain that God made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. There is an apologetic aspect to the book of Acts, and there is an apologetic aspect to the book of Luke, in that he was providing a ton of details. Both the gospel account and the book of Acts are very detail rich, so that he could have certainty concerning those things. Now look at John 4:42. It says, they said to the woman, it's no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is indeed the Savior of the world. So the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman that Jesus engaged with there and told her things that only God can know, the way that Jesus revealed them, they heard of that through her. Then they heard for themselves and they said, hey, we believe. Sister Sherry, did you have a comment? They took Apollos aside. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so truth and certainty. So can we have certainty in knowing that we can know truth, and knowing that God exists, and knowing that the Bible is inspired, and knowing that Jesus is the Son? And that's the point of this class, is not just to offer out, hey, here's an option. We want to argue the case. As the old saying goes, God said it, I believe it, that's it. Okay. All right, Brother Russ.
On 7b, that because one does know everything, but he does not.
Yeah, thank you, Russ. There is a typo on 7b, because one does, it should say not know everything and lacks omniscience. Thank you, Russ.
Then 6d3, this view does not mean.
Yeah, so what this view does not mean is that truth can be very messy and even incredibly painful.
The lead-in for D says it does not mean that.
Yeah, so truth can be very messy. So an absolute view of truth does not mean, so truth can be messy. That's what I'm trying to say. Truth can be messy and even incredibly painful. Absolute truth can be that way. So yeah, for that statement, thank you, Russ. Yeah, that's right. Okay, thank you, Russ. So what I'm trying to say is that truth can be messy and painful. And yeah, so there's missing a knot there. Thank you. Okay, truth and rationality at 8 there. Rationality means that we're using reason. And the law of rationality states we ought to justify our conclusions by adequate evidence. What that means is that we're using a reasoning process. We're using a cognitive process in these things. And so we have to ask questions like, what counts for adequate evidence? If we're going to say that reason is one of the ways that we arrive at truth, we're going to have to ask questions like, in mathematics, what is proof? What counts as adequate evidence? In weather prediction, what counts as adequate evidence? So in weather prediction, it's probability based. In mathematics, there are conclusive proofs that establish certain factors. In law, there are various standards of proof. There is the preponderance of evidence. This is a standard of more likely than not. There's clear and convincing evidence, and then there is evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. Sometimes percentages are attributed to those various legal standards, but this is what we're talking about when we're talking about using reason. And so in law, you want, for the most serious offenses, you want the state to be able to hold up the burden of proof that they have to establish beyond a reasonable doubt. And so you don't want that, well, it's more likely than not that he's the murderer, right? Because then there could be a multiplicity of individuals that could meet that standard, right? Well, it's more likely than not that this individual. So you want the state to withstand or hold up that level of evidence in sustaining the claim. So reason or rationality differs from rationalization. Rationalization is when people try to justify themselves, and so try to assert their way, their mindset, their way of thinking. And rationalization flies in the face of objective truth as given by God. And so remember in Luke chapter 10, the account of the Good Samaritan, this individual is trying to justify themselves. So then Jesus goes on to tell the account of the Good Samaritan. Irrationality, and again, this is used in a way, not in the mental health way, okay? Not that people can't be irrational when it comes to mental health, but in this logical way, that's the way it's being used here, it's to draw conclusions that are not warranted by adequate evidence. So it fails mathematically, it fails test of probability, it fails to meet legal thresholds. And so this is, when we talk about reason, this is areas where reason abounds. There's also evasions of the law of rationality. If you were to take a logic class or an argumentation class or rhetoric class, you would read about fallacies. You would study fallacies, logical fallacies. You can get online. If you ever take a critical thinking class, you can look at, arguments that are made, appeals to authority. So this is, Michael Jordan wears Hanes. All right, well, what makes Michael Jordan an authority on underwear? All right, he's a great basketball player. He wears them, I assume. But what makes him an authority on that? So you're appealing to an authority. It's not that all authorities are bad authorities, but an appeal to authority where one doesn't have some expertise, right? And so, is this individual qualified to speak in an expert way on this particular matter? So appeals to emotion. I cannot bear to think it is untrue. I'm missing a is there. Cannot bear to think it is untrue, it should say. So that would be, just an appeal to emotion. And sometimes in discussions or in deliberations or in the media, there's an appeal to emotion. And, in critical thinking, you learn to kind of look through that, to look at the argument. There's an argument ad hominem. That's an argument directed at a person. So you're attacking the character of a person instead of what they're saying. There's an argument from ignorance or to ignorance, ad ignorantium. It's true because you cannot disprove it. So this is quite an interesting line of thought. It's an appeal to ignorance. So if you can't prove it's not the case, people will reason that it is, but that's a fallacy. All right. So where does this come into to discussion, right? So let's say a person tells you, no, I had a near-death experience, and as I died, I saw a white light, and I saw my relatives standing in that white light, and Jesus was calling my name, right? And angels were with halos were swirling at the end of the foot of my bed. All right. So how are you and I going to engage with such an assertion? Okay, they're telling you I experienced this, right? So how would you answer somebody like that, Sherry?
There are a lot of people who have actually near-death experiences. They didn't literally die,
Mm-hmm.
but it's quite clear that it is appointed unto man once to die. After that, because he cannot die physically. That the only person who did it.
Right. So what Sherry's doing is she's reasoning from the scriptures, right? So it's appointed at, so what's going to evaluate? You're claiming this personal experience. Another person is claiming a different personal experience. Another person is claiming another personal experience. So is there a truth that evaluates, that stands over personal experience? And you've got people that make claims about the Holy Spirit. Holy Spirit did X, the Holy Spirit did Y, the Holy Spirit did Z. I know it, I was there, right? I saw it with my own eyes. Is the Holy Spirit a spirit of contradiction? Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Okay. All right.
When we say near-death experience.
Okay.
I don't know, we have to be careful how we use it, because they can actually say, well, I know it's going to die once, I died, and I nearly died.
Mm-hmm.
All this almost getting.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? So you have to be careful how you use it.
Sure.
Make sure that otherwise just negate it there.
Okay. So Margaret points out that we need to be careful about which passage we use, depending on what arguments people are making. And that's certainly valid.
Daniel?
Okay, other things that we could say. Yes.
Sorry. Is it always necessary to address an issue like that? And this is where I'm coming from. A lot of those instances like you described, the person has a lot of emotion tied up in that.
Sure.
It's very difficult to argue emotions or about emotions. And many times it seems to me like it's better to find a topic to sort of skirt the issue for the moment and find something more concrete and rationally based to discuss, and then after a time maybe go back and revisit the emotional issue. But if a person's whole sense of being is tied up in their near-death experience, it seems a dangerous ground to me to tread on right from the start, because you might alienate them forever. I mean, they're going to feel like you're calling a liar and so forth. And I'm not saying don't address the issue. I just say maybe not right now.
Okay, so there's some good Bible passages that talk about being as wise as serpents, and harmless as doves, and let your speech, be gracious, right? Seasoned with salt. So there is some wisdom in that, Sister Mary, in the fact that we need to, if this is our first conversation with this person, and the very first thing they say is that, maybe we table, we don't have to address, I don't think we have to address every issue at its, on the face of, like you're saying. I think we can, we can table some issues for another time and, find some common ground, build some rapport. And I think that's what you're saying. We certainly appreciate that. In terms of begging the question, the conclusion merely restates the evidence. So, ethics is good because it is good. Nothing's really been proven there. And so other areas, diverting the issue, evidence is offered for a different proposition than the one that's presented there. And then special pleading, that is a cherry picking. And some people have their sources. They only choose those sources. They refuse to read any sources that might contradict what they're saying or disagree with what they're saying. And one of the things about, and we pointed this out about the book of Acts, is you see lots of adversarial exchanges in both the gospel accounts and in the book of Acts. There's lots of conflict going on. And, in terms of diversity in the first century, there is a ton of back and forth there. Our legal system is an adversarial system. You've got, defense attorneys on one side, prosecution on the other. And from that, justice is supposed to be upheld. And that's at least the goal. So cherry picking could be, well, we're only going to talk about passages that really support my particular point of view. Well, that's not an honest approach to Scripture. And okay, so we're going to be dismissive and not address these other passages that could play into the discussion. And so we want to be honest in our approach to Scripture and hold up the truth and follow it wherever it leads. So in moving forward here, there are some common objections that people have in terms of truth. And I want to just share a few of those. We won't spend a ton of time just for the sake of moving forward tonight. Agnosticism is a person who says that there's not sufficient evidence to warrant the conclusion that men can know that God exists. Men or women can know that God exists. So the agnostic holds that there's not an evidence available to draw a yes or no conclusion. It's self-refuting because if you advance agnosticism and you say one does not know whether God exists or not, the problem with that is you can't really get that off the ground because you're claiming to know at least that much. So if you can't know that God exists or not, you can't even claim that, right? So you see, it starts internally arguing. It's agnosticism itself is advancing something that's not agnostic. When I say I can't know whether God exists or not, right? I'm arguing at least that that's true, which isn't agnostic. It's self-refuting. Do you see that? So you can't even really get that off the ground. And so it doesn't mean that we can't, that we know everything about everything. It doesn't mean that we have knowledge absolutely, like God does. It doesn't mean that we're omniscient. But what we can know, we can act on. And so when we say we cannot know the truth, that we're affirming a truth that's known while denying that it can be known. So you can see where it's self-refuting there. Anti-theism is the belief that opposes theism. It stands against it. Atheism is the belief that God does not exist. Some of these have some overlap here. Empiricism, when you think about empiricism, think about what's empirical in terms of what is observable with the senses, what you see, what you taste, what you touch, what you smell. All of these involve our ability, our sense perception. And so when you see the ism there, right, at the end of these words, when a person says the only way that I can arrive at truth is via my senses. See, then if you were to have a discussion with someone like that, the problem with that is, what about all of these things that you don't experience? Or what about all of these events in life that you have limited experience with? You know, you might watch on television a news report of what happened in Tennessee. All right, you didn't see the floods with your own eyes. You didn't see the rain come down. You didn't see the cars flipped over. You didn't see all the deaths that resulted. You may have some recordings of what happened afterwards. You may have limited understanding of those things. So are you going to say that unless I see it with video recording or audio reception, what about all of these historical facts, right? You never saw George Washington. All right, so you never experienced him firsthand. Will you take the testimony of different people throughout history who affirm his existence, affirm him being the first president? Will you take that? See, an empiricist would say, well, I didn't experience this with my own five senses or one of the five senses. So important to think about that. Was there a comment? No. Okay. Existentialism, when you think about that, think about our existence. And so that's a way that I try to remember that. That was a movement that centers on analyzing individual existence in an unfathomable universe and the plight of the individual who must assume ultimate responsibility for acts of free will without any certain knowledge of what is right or wrong or good or bad. So this idea of existentialism was at one time a espoused philosophical doctrine. Another one is called fideism. That's this notion about faith. And fideism, again, there's some historical philosophical aspects to this. Religious fideism argues matters of faith and religion, religious belief are not supported by reason. Religion is a matter of faith and cannot be argued by reason. In other words, that's this notion that we've talked about before, where people say where a proof ends, faith begins. And I want us to know that that's false. We're saying that faith is supported by evidence, that we can come to a knowledge that God exists. Look at Hebrews 11, verse 6 for just a moment. Hebrews 11:6. Without faith, it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. All right, so we fixate on a phrase there. We must believe, whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists. So if I must believe, what is the evidence that leads me to the conclusion of that, hey, I can trust this information? Not only do I have knowledge of it, I can trust it. I can rely. This is sure. I can put a nail in it, right? I can hang my hat on it. Where does that come? So this idea of faith is not in the absence of information or the absence of proof. And so this idea of religious fightyism is problematic because of the way that it looks at faith. Now, are there certain religions that should be abandoned because of their standards, because of their teachings, because of is a skepticism towards certain religions warranted? What do you think? Should we be skeptical of certain faiths? What do you think? Yeah, right.
This is the Bible religion. This is something that was conceived from the man, not a man, more so than what I can see this stuff was done.
Right.
We base our 17 to 16 scripture 5 by God, not 3.
Right. Sure, absolutely. Comment was made that there's certainly things that warrant religious skepticism. And the comment was made, there's a lot of New Age thinking, and appreciate Brother Colbert bringing those things out. There's a lot of, we've got to the scriptures as the final authority. And so, you look at the history, you look at where did this faith group begin? What are its teachings? Does it align with scripture or not? The Bible would say we need to test the spirits to see whether they be from God or not. Look in your Bibles, if you will, at Acts 5 for just a moment. And this is, if you want to write it in the margin of your notes there, this is just a quick rabbit I want to chase. Acts chapter 5, Gamaliel is standing up there or is present there in the midst of a very hotly contested issue. And he is a Pharisee of the council. He's a teacher of law. Look at verse 35. And so the apostles have been arrested, and they've said we must obey God rather than man. And so here they are evaluating their guilt or innocence to some extent. And notice in verse 35, and he said to them, this is Gamaliel, men of Israel, take care what you are about to do with these men. For before these days, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. He was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. So Gamaliel says, hey, if Jesus isn't the Christ, we're going to find out. We're going to know, right? And here's an example of truth on trial in the life of Theudas. Why, to my knowledge, are there no followers or adherents of Theudas today? Well, Gamaliel told them why then, and it's the same reason why we can't go along with certain teachings, religious teachings in our world, or we shouldn't go along with certain religious teachings in our world because of they've been exposed for the false teaching that they are. So look at verse 36. For before these days, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody. 400 men. He was killed. So drawing a parallel, Jesus was killed, but he rose. Theudas did not. And his followers were dispersed. And then he uses another example. And after him, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people after him. He too perished, and all who followed him were scattered. So Gamaliel tells the Pharisee council of two instances, two case studies where he says, look what happened to the followers of them. But then notice this. So in the present case, I tell you, keep away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan or this undertaking is of man, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even be found opposing God. Now, this is powerful. Why? Because Gamaliel is saying, hey, let truth, let's not have this, this biased outlook on these men who have done a good deed. Right? Truth will reveal whether their testimony is valid or not. Leilani?
I believe that it needs to be controlled skepticism and not of their own opinion, their own mind. A lot of people, when they say that they're gonna, oh, this is bad, this is horrible, they're just saying it just to say it. They're not even saying it because they actually are looking at the word. So that's one thing that we can't forget when going upon these
Sure.
religions.
Mm-hmm.
Having a very controlled
Okay.
skepticism.
All right. So Leilani brings out we should have a controlled skepticism. And I think what she means by that is, we're gentle in our approach and open to listen. James talk about being quick to hear and slow to speak. And so certainly that's would be admirable in engaging with people. We want to treat them like we want to be treated. And if we were in error, someone would be our friend, certainly, to show us, right, according to the word, and do it with a spirit of meekness. Margaret?
Along with that, you immediately dismiss them and never going to bring them to Christ.
Okay.
You won't even engage with them, just dismiss them. Oh,
Right.
Just like they want to dismiss their parents, they want to dismiss us
Mm-hmm.
and never give us a chance. We have to listen to them to be able to teach them. You don't
That's
know
right.
Teach them if you don't know what, as we talked before, if you don't know, like we do it at Sunday morning, if you don't know what they believe, you can't teach them right.
So we don't want to, Margaret points out, we don't want to be dismissive of folks. We want to give them time to think. And, sometimes what that means is, baby steps, right? Baby steps in terms of, all right, we're not going to study everything tonight. If you'll open the Bible with me, let's read this passage and let's walk away, you and I, on the same page on this chapter. Sherry?
It's like the old African proverb, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
Okay. Sherry brings out, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So in giving them the truth, we give it in digestible, segments. Logical positivism. And this is another popular, and several of these are, popular philosophy terms that you'll hear. And this is just my basic glossary of some of those things, challenges to truth that we see in the marketplace. This is that positive facts and their relations in terms of when we inquire into things, we're dismissive of questions of meaning in theology. So logical positivism is a system of thought that confined intellectual inquiry to observable facts and their relations. So it kind of goes back to that empiricism. Can we observe it? And if we can't, in other words, it kind of rules out with the wave of a hand with certain philosophical twist that led to criticism of religion as not being, now notice this philosophy led to criticism of religion, not as being false or unknowable, but as unverifiable and therefore meaningless. And so it's saying you can't prove it. There's no test for religion. Therefore, that's the logical positivist. And so if you see that term, of course, a lot could be said more about all of these things. Materialism goes along with naturalism. And that is this notion that in the world, the only thing that can be truly proven is that there's matter, and all things are composed of matter. And, there's no account of spirit or consciousness. And we'll look at naturalism after modernism and postmodernism. The contrast in modernism and postmodernism is when you come out of the baby boomer generation, right? So my father's generation, my grandfather's generation was of the mindset, if you go to college or you go to trade school, you go to learn a truth that can be applied so that you can put food in your stomach and a roof over your head. So there are real facts, they're tangible, truth can be known. You go to advance in your understanding. So modern is often pictured as pursuing truth. It's being cerebral, so-called intellectual, if you will. And then postmodernism, in contrast, is viewed as, a lot more open-mindedness. Everybody has their own truth. And so where modernism would say, hey, let's get to the bottom of this. Let's find the answer to this situation. Postmodernism would say, hey, I appreciate your perspective. Let's just leave it at that. So let me just give you an illustration of the difference between a modernist perspective and a postmodernist. So imagine a religious teacher. Imagine Dave is teaching Hebrew. And here he's digging into a passage in the Old Testament. And he's like, here's a Hebrew word, and here's its stuff. Here's its stem. Here, whether it's a verb or, I don't know enough about Hebrew, probably even talk about this. But, Dave is an expert in the fact that he's studied Hebrew. He's now teaching Hebrew. He understands context, syntax, diction, all of these moving parts, if you will, in a Hebrew phrase, in a Hebrew sentence, if you will. Dave gets those things, right? So these are moving parts in the language. So let's say that someone raises their hand and says, in the audience, and says, well, I disagree. Well, then, a modernist would say, well, truth can be known based on the language, whether Dave's opinion holds water or whether the person in the audience's opinion holds water, right? The modernists would say, hey, we can get to the bottom of that. But in the postmodern era, right, if Dave comes back and says, hey, listen, I understand what you're saying there, but what you're saying is not supported by the language. It's not supported by the text. All of a sudden, in the postmodern era, that's a personal affront, right? In the postmodern era, every voice is to be heard. Every voice is to be appreciated. But you know what? Every voice is not right. Right? And since there is truth, and we can know that there's truth, right? Not everybody's opinion should be valued. But here in the postmodern era, if you say, hey, you know what? You're absolutely wrong. Right? What you're saying, I understand what you're saying. I respect you as a person, but what you're saying goes clearly against the text. All right. If you say that in a class or say that one-on-one, especially in America, right? That's looked at as you being unkind, you being, arrogant, you putting yourself up on a pedestal, which may not be the case at all, right? You simply said, hey, the scripture says this, you don't believe it. You have your own opinion. Your opinion is at odds with scripture. Right? So what's going to evaluate opinions? All right. Are we just going to say, well, all these conflicting beliefs, we just need to listen to them. We just need to hear them. We need to have, we just need to swirl in a marketplace of ideas. Everybody has a religious smorgasbord and you choose this flavor and I'll choose this flavor on this issue. And then, maybe we'll flip on another issue. Right. And, that's a dangerous way to approach the truth. Where what now? Safe zones. Yeah, I would suppose. Yeah. So. Right. Right. Okay, Dave and then Steve.
I just have a question. So would the approach be is that you have to come to an agreement that there is an absolute truth? And then it's a matter of discovering that absolute truth.
That's right.
You can't come to an agreement there's absolute truth. You cannot come to agreement at all.
That's right. So that we do, you know, what's going to be our starting point? Yeah. And so in postmodernism, the starting point is me and whatever I make up or whatever I want or whatever I perceive truth to be. So, and that's why it's so erosive and it's so destructive in our day and age. Brother Steve? Yeah, that's the notion, right? Can't we all just get along? Yeah. Leilani?
There is a trans activist person who goes to a trans activist church. And I was listening to one of their little things just to see how can they be trans active, you know? I mean, I'm okay, you want to be trans, whatever, that doesn't agree with me.
Mhm.
But for a church to say you're trans active, it's very concerning. So I listened to one of their things, and the pastor stood up in front of everybody and said, there was a mistake in Genesis. What actually happened was this, and he completely rewrote the beginning of the Bible, saying that Adam, Eve, and Satan were all taught by God in Eden, and that we just all can make it to Eden no matter what we do. I'm like, how does that work?
Yeah.
You're a Christian person. How
Mhm.
does that work?
Yeah. Yeah. Good.
As I say to that, it's just a bunch of Campbell Buddy salad.
So Leilani pointed out that there is a trans activist, you called it trans activist?
Trans activists.
And give me a working definition, if you don't mind.
It's people who believe that anybody that is trans,
Like transgender?
yes,
Okay.
fits in with
Okay.
society perfectly.
Okay. All right. So trans activist is people that are transgender that believe that all transgenders or maybe most transgenders fit into society perfectly. Brother Carl?
So that goes into what we always said. We are a part of what we've been taught. Everyone's a part of what we've been taught, what religion you've been approached with, how we've grown up. And if you've been taught in error, you may not realize that, but you can be just as sincere about that as she's thinking as an error, because that's what you've been taught.
Right.
And never know the difference.
That's right.
We have to myself open. This is what I always kept when I'm teaching.
Mhm.
I had a light bulb moment. I was being taught by a brother in the church, and a light bulb went on that some things clicked that I had never heard before.
Right.
But I also get people to be open and say, well, if it's true, if something can be shown me to be true that I was never exposed to, I was taught in error, then I have to be willing to accept. Maybe I'm wrong,
That's right.
and be willing to change it. But we are all a part of what we. So that's why it's so crucial. I press my congregation, know somebody. You have to know what we're talking about. Most people, the average person in the pews, whatever the preacher says, they go on. They do not study, they do not know. And that's why we have a lot of problems in the church now. We are not informed, we're not educated. And so we have to still, you have to know somebody. I appreciate Brother Ray Duncan so much. Know your Bible.
Yes. Brother Carl brings out the point that we're a product of what we've studied, what we've heard, whose feet we've sat at. And we've got to know the Bible for ourselves. And he brought out another point that's important, that we need to approach these things with humility. And if we're wrong, and if our beliefs are at odds with Scripture, you know, let truth prevail. Let's not be so entrenched in our way of thinking that we think it's impossible that we could be wrong. So the great observations, great points there. Let's look at naturalism. Naturalism is the belief that the world is the whole show. It's the belief that the physical material world is all there is, and excludes the supernatural or spiritual. Scientific naturalists insist on explaining everything in terms of physical and chemical laws. However, a commitment to naturalism is not solely a physical process. It is a commitment of the mind. The mind is more than merely neurological firings, processes, and reactions. The problem with naturalism is that it's self-refuting. One cannot get off the ground the notion that everything is the result of physical or chemical processes without first making a move that is neither physical or chemical. Geisler writes, a theory or law about physical processes is obviously not itself a physical process. So notice in a science class, the professor is not going to say to you, hey, by the way, I'm switching over now to the philosophy of science. Professor's not going to say that. The teaching of facts comes also in a teaching of the evaluation of those facts, right? Put it in a context. What are you measuring? What does that number mean? What's it mean relative to another number? What's this distance mean? What's it mean? What are we looking at inside the cell? And so science is not a neutral party in all of these discussions when we start talking about the origin of life or the operation of life and things like that. A great book, if you want to read it, is a book written by a professor named Philip Johnson. He wrote a book back in the 90s called Darwin on Trial. It's a short book. It's powerful. Here's why. Johnson was a Berkeley law professor who was, if I remember right, very adept at trial law. So here he is at a highly acclaimed school teaching law professor. He takes a sabbatical from Berkeley and he wants to get at the bottom of the evolution argument in the United States. So he studies and he starts digging in. So he's not a scientist, right? He's not a philosopher, but he's a law professor who understands argumentation. And he in this book he writes, because he understands adversity in a legal setting, right? He understands the prosecution and the arguments that they're made. He understands the defense and the arguments that they make. He understands that when you go to trial, you've got to be prepared. The defense has to know every hole the prosecution's going to try to poke in their case, right? He knows that. He's a trial lawyer. So he's not afraid to look at information. So when Philip Johnson writes this book, he writes in it about so much bias that exists in the teaching of origins in the United States. And Johnson was really important in coalescing a movement called the Intelligent Design Movement. There's a group of individuals in Seattle, it's called discovery.org. You can go there, but it's got some individuals that are pretty academic, but Johnson really exposed in America in that book some problems with the scientific establishment. And, you know, you look in public schools in America and you look at the American Academy of Sciences. So he's a lawyer that's not afraid to say, okay, here's what the one group is saying. Here's what another group is saying. All right, here's where you're silencing those who take an oppositional view to what the establishment holds. And it's a wonderful book. In one of my classes, I wrote a review of it. And if you have a chance, it's short, but it's called Darwin on Trial. But it really shows so often there's a philosophical commitment when it comes to evolution. And we'll spend some time later in this class, Lord willing, talking about that. I can't explain it. And here's what happens in science sometimes. We don't have an evolutionary explanation for X, Y, or Z yet, but evolution will eventually explain it. Wait, whoa, time out. You're telling me you're philosophically committed to evolution, which is unguided, unintelligent processes, random processes, are going to explain something that we don't know yet? So that's what you're selling me? So there's this philosophical, well, we don't know yet. We don't have an understanding yet. We're still searching for the answers here. We're still exploring. Evolution's going to show us the way. Wait, time out. See, you're committed philosophically, and Johnson really does a beautiful job of pointing that out. Even though you have a bad explanation, a false explanation, you're philosophically committed to its explanatory power when you don't have answers. So that's well, I'll move on. It's over 7 o'clock. It's 7:01. Let's go ahead and take our break, and we'll come back and look at pluralism at 7:17.
Daniel,
Did you have a comment?
but it doesn't have to be for the class.
Okay.
I had to step away for a minute at the beginning. I have no clue what notes you're looking at. I've gone through everything I have. I can't figure out what you're looking at. What you're going.
So if you go to page 23, you go in the document that was sent at the, okay. If you go online, Mary, in the folder that I shared with you, that has the password,
Yeah,
are you able to see that?
yeah, the folder with additional readings.
Yeah, so look at number 1 there, the notes. See where it says final. So I updated those today.
Oh, that I did. Uh-huh.
Yeah, so I'm on page 23.
Okay.
So every week I'm going to add to that, Lord willing, except maybe the week I'm not. Okay, it is that time. Okay, so pluralism is the belief in multiple, even conflicting ideas. And so not only do we live in a society that is postmodern, but also pluralistic, and that is multiple, even conflicting beliefs. Let's agree to disagree. Well, why, upon what things should we agree to disagree? Is this a matter of liberty in Scripture, or is this a matter of obligation? And so to shift that, right, one of the problems in religious teaching is when people get those categories confused, right? This is a matter of obligation. Someone's saying it's optional. And, Scripture doesn't say that it's optional. So that can be a problem. So pluralism is multiple, even conflicting beliefs. Pragmatism, it works. Hey, this works. So we ought to abide by it. So what if it's lying, and lying works for some people? Does that mean that it's biblically okay? We've got to look at not only if it works, but is it right? Does it correspond with truth? Rationalism is the belief that reason and reason alone is, Scripture is a logical, rational mind, God's mind, that is revealed in a word to us. It's reasonable, it's understandable, it's discernible. We can arrive at conclusions based upon that word. It is God's revelation of himself in written form is a rational approach, but rationalism says that reason and reason alone is how we arrive at truth. And so some of these things, as we look at them, it's not that we're saying that empirical ways of looking at the world are false in every respect. But when we say empiricism, we've cut out other ways of arriving at truth. Empiricism says that it's the sensory experience and sensory experience alone. So rationalism says reason and reason alone. And so we don't want to, once we say this and this alone, then we eliminate other things that may be helpful in arriving at truth. So God's word is practical. right? You look at biblical principles that are applied and you see that in some business settings, they're wildly successful, right? In terms of being a good neighbor, being hospitable, being friendly, those characteristics in certain businesses are wildly successful. And so God's word is practical when applied appropriately. Relativism, that's this belief. Again, notice the ism there. It's the notion that everything is relative. And so that there, again, when you say something's relative, how do you even speak of what's relative without something fixed on which to evaluate what's relative or not? Relativism is the notion that everything is relative. Everything is relative. So I give you a couple definitions there. Moral relativism, there's no objective, independent moral truth. That's what it argues. All moral judgments are equally worthy. Moral judgments are relative to individuals or relative to cultures. Ethics is no longer a prescriptive discipline, but one that is purely descriptive. It implies that moral mistakes cannot be made. It also implies that Hitler's ethic is as correct as those who oppose Hitler. So that would be moral relativism. Social relativism, again, there's overlap in these different types of relativism. So this would be different nations, different social groups, where people would say, well, you know, that's the way my group or this group does it versus that group. There's relativism would say, hey, if there's a group of people that, you know, I think I used this example before in this class in Ghana, West Africa, there was a time when a chief would die and they would behead people depending on how high that chief was in certain social settings, and they would set the limbs of the chief on heads that had been decapitated. Okay, so is that okay because it was practiced there? And, you know, in America, we would say that that's murder, right? We would say it's illegal. We would say that it's wrong. Well, the social relativists, by implication, could say, well, it's relative, right? I mean, if that group by consensus agrees in a social contract, which is what law is, if they, you know, whether it's formal or implied, that's what they want to do, who are we to judge? You know, that's how a relativist would approach such things. Personal relativism means for my own preference that certain things are true and right. And, you know, it ends up in moral chaos. And so scientism kind of goes along with this notion of empiricism. We're on page 24 in the notes. So if you're following along, again, go to document. It's got a 1 by it in the file that I shared with you guys. And I've updated it for, of course, this was last week's teaching. I've updated it. It's got the next set of notes in that. So every week, go to that document. It's got a number 1 by it, and it's I'm updating that week by week. Scientism goes along with empiricism, and that is this notion that science is what gives us real truth. And we can know it. We can, you know, it's valuable to us. The science will give us the real answers to things. It raises its head, scientism does, in materialism and atheism and other areas that we've gone over here. Secularism, rules takes off the table any notion of God. It goes back to a man in the 1850s by the name of G.J. Holyoake. And that's this, it took God off the table in discussion. Subjectivism is, you know, this notion that it denies any objective, real arena of realm and facts outside my own mind. And it holds to the notion that perception is reality, that there's no underlying true reality that exists independent of perception. Now, here's what's interesting, and we've talked about this. Our response, again, this is objective truth. The Bible is objective truth. My response to it is subjective. In other words, my life, I want it to align with this, right? I want it to align with the New Testament teaching. I want it to align with the pattern and model my life according to Christ. And subjectivism, though, says that there's no objective truth. And so that's one of the problems. So in looking at this information and boiling it down, how do we make it practical? Again, reason is important, but when we say rationalism, we're saying reason alone. Using our senses is important, but then when we say empiricism, we're saying empirical senses alone. When we say pragmatism, here is what's practical, but pragmatism says what's practical alone. And so we could go on with various things that we've looked at here. It's when we make them the whole of our truth yielding life that they become problematic. Now, in the Bible, it's practical, it's rational, right? It puts personal experience in its proper place. God wants us to have the best experience that we can in this life and in the one to come. So the Bible brings in multiple facets of some of these ideas, but it puts them in balance. When they get out of balance, then you can see hearts that deviate from the word. Okay, let's look at page 26 here. And we want, for the sake of time, to kind of pick up the pace a little bit. I do want to get to the war and flu debate. Let me share a couple passages with you tonight. And then look in your Bibles at Romans chapter 1. When we talk about apologetics, we're talking about the fact that we can know truth, that God exists, that the Bible's inspired, that Jesus is the Son of God. And I want you to look in Romans chapter 1 and verse 16. Well, back up to 14 there. Paul will say he's under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians, to the wise and foolish. He's eager to preach the gospel to those who are in Rome. So Rome's a melting pot, right? Rome's a melting pot of people from different places. It is the center of the world, so to speak, in his day. We talk about the book of Acts from Jerusalem to Rome, right? So here's a letter to Rome. He's under obligation to preach the gospel. What is it, Paul? Verse 16. I'm not ashamed of it. It's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, or some translations say from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. So there is this righteous component. There is this empowering from God in a special revelation that gives righteousness in the life of individuals, right? The whole concept of justification, justified by blood, justified by grace, justified by faith, justified by works in James. Here's this idea of righteousness that's imputed, Romans chapter 4, credited to somebody's account. So the gospel gives the message of what adds righteousness to somebody's life, if you will. For the wrath of God, verse 18, is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. My immoral life, right, stands between God and righteousness, right? If I live in sin, if I abandon the truth, Paul says that unrighteousness suppresses truth. Well, how does that happen? Well, if I'm living immorally, right? If I'm living outside of God's word, I'm suppressing it, right? I'm standing in the way. I'm standing in God's way. God's going to hold me accountable for that. Verse 19, for what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. All right, now I want you to think about what he's saying here. There is plain revelation from God in a general way. Now, Romans chapter 1, verse 19 is what people sometimes refer to as general revelation. Special revelation is the written word of God. General revelation is how God reveals himself in general. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. Paul, what has God shown them? For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So here's information that comes to mankind in creation. Now, watch what he's saying here. It's quite remarkable. his invisible attributes, his eternal power, his divine nature have been clearly perceived. Wait, Paul, it's invisible. How do I perceive that which is invisible? So what's happening here is this move from physics, which is the material world, we might call it, not necessarily a physics class, but the physical. We're moving from the physical to the metaphysical. What's that mean? There is an aspect of our world where God is screaming to us, I would say, revealing himself to us, that transcends our world. It's not enough just to say, what a beautiful sunset. It's not enough just to say, well, the moon is this distance from the earth, right? You might calculate those things. Paul is saying that there is a moral response to the data, the facts, right? The information. There is a moral response to the data that comes to us. So in philosophy, and it gets kind of technical sometimes, the difference between the physical and the metaphysical. Metaphysical has to deal with what transcends our world. Can we know what transcends this world? Well, Paul would say here that ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, they are without excuse. Why? Because we can reason from the effect. So when you look at the speed that the earth is rotating at as we speak at the equator, 1,000 miles an hour. That's more than the speed of sound, right? Right now at the equator, it's actually over 1,000. I think it's like 1,036 or something like that. Brother Steve?
I feel that this shows that morally man knows the difference between right and wrong.
That's right.
Even though he may not practice what's right.
That's right.
Morally, in his soul,
Mm-hmm.
he knows the difference between right and wrong.
Right. Steve brings out that morally in man's soul, he knows the difference between right and wrong. And so do we live and move and enjoy life in creation and deny a creator? That's problematic. Do you see all the fine-tuning principles that exist in our world that, you think about our ability to exist, our ability even to be here, all the fine-tuning things that have to happen in order for you to be born, right? All the things that go on inside the womb, all the things that go on in terms of reproduction, all the things that go on in terms of respiration, all the things that go on inside the cell, all the things that go on with clotting, all the things that go on in medicine inside your body, that when they get off, right, we suffer. Sometimes when they get off, we die. And so these are fine-tuning principles. So I want us to see from the text here, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God. There's a moral response that we're to have. One is to reason from creation to the creator, reason from the visible to the invisible. And so honor that God, honor the one God. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged, watch verse 25, the truth about God for a lie. So from effect to cause, from creation to creator, from truth that can be known, truth that can be applied, truth that can be understood, and there's the swap out, right? I'm gonna swap it. So the true God demands knowing him, right? Observing God in creation demands that I honor him, give thanks to him. If I don't, I'm without excuse. And there's this swapping out that goes on constantly. It happens in in academic circles all the time, right? What is sin? For all have sinned, fallen short of the glory of God. So here's a falling short of glory. Look at 123, an exchange of glory, right? You swap out glory, you get in big trouble. So now what the Gentiles there are doing are they're exchanging glory, immortal images, mortal man, birds, animals, reptiles. That's not what God. So there's this aspect of apologetics that entails both truth, both knowledge, but also ethics and morality. We are to have a proper response to that. In John 8, and we're on page 26 in your notes here, there's this great exposition of knowledge. John takes up in John chapter 8, knowing where Jesus came from, knowing that Jesus is of the Father. I think that should be of the Father instead of or the Father. Knowing that Jesus is the Son of Man sent from the Father, knowing the truth, knowing the offspring of Abraham. The Jews charge that knowing that Jesus charge him as having a demon. All of this involves this aspect of knowledge. Where does knowledge come from? What is the basis of knowledge? And so Jesus is engaging. This is a practical exchange between people that don't accept him, don't accept his teaching, don't accept his Father, don't accept the prophets, don't accept the miracles, right? These are people that are adversarial. It's not everybody here in John chapter 8 is a fan with pom-poms leading him on. That's not what's going on there. It's adamant opposition and disagreement. What's the basis of knowledge? Where does it come from? Salvation is predicated on knowing truth. Faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word of God. Galatians 4:9 speaks of those who have come to know God. Peter and Paul and John wrote to individuals who knew the truth. And so we're compelled to ask, where does knowledge come from? Where does truth come from? That involves the study of epistemology. And that's a fancy philosophical word. A lot of detail in philosophical circles deals with these questions, but I just want to give you a basic list of questions that epistemology looks at. How do we know something? How is it? When is it justified? Is it certain? Does sensory perception give us reliable information? Are we directly aware of the physical world? All of these things involve this idea of epistemology. This is how we know what we know. Now, if you are taking this class for credit, one of the things that I would want you to know is in D there, the Bible is the epistemological center of every human life. That is, it's driving knowledge. It is special revelation. It's how do we know what's truth? How do we know what's error? How do we test the spirits, as John would talk about? Well, it's the word of God that's distinguishing righteousness from unrighteousness, light from darkness, bitter from sweet, truth from error, faith from unbelief. All of these things are driven by the word of God. And so this is an important teaching. So coming to knowledge, and we've talked about this already, so I won't read this to you, but one of the ways that we come to knowledge is by our senses. What we see, what we taste, what we touch, what we hear, what we smell. These involve our senses. Remember Thomas, unless he personally experienced. Now, he had testimony that was sufficient he had the truth at his disposal, we might say, or at his hands, at his fingertips, but he wanted to touch. He wanted empirical verifiability. And if he didn't get it, he would never believe. That's problematic. If we set up the bar as if I've got to have, God, you've got to prove yourself to me. And God, I'm going to tell you how you're going to prove yourself to me. And if you don't prove yourself to me that way, I'm never going to believe in you. People do that in their own hearts. God, show me a sign. God, here's my loved one laying in bed on a ventilator. If you don't allow him to live, I'm done with you. People act that way towards God. Jackson?
Who are we to tell God to prove himself in that way?
That's absolutely right. Right. Who are we, Jackson says, to tell God that he needs to prove himself to us in that way? And so our empirical senses are one way that we arrive at truth. Another way is by reason. And when we talk about reason, there are different ways that we can reason. One is called induction. Induction, most scientific studies are inductive in their findings. That is, that the conclusion is probable. So in medicine, we do a lot of things with induction and statistics and probability. And there are various statistical tests. Are the sample sizes sufficient? Was the right statistical test applied? Was the conclusion stated in such a way that's true to the findings? And so, when I was in, Katrina and I were in pharmacy school, we had classes in biostatistics. And do you remember what they said in there? A few things. So it was interesting to look at the different ways statisticians would look at various scientific tests. And so I give you an illustration there of inductive reasoning. One of the things that you should know, and from a scientific perspective, is correlation does not equal causality. So one of the modern illustrations of that is with vaccines. So there is a vaccine reporting system in the United States, and if a person has died following the vaccine, that's reported, and so that information is taken in, and adverse effects are reported to concerning vaccines. Because a person died following a vaccine does not necessarily mean it's the vaccine. Doesn't mean that that's not that it couldn't be the case, right? But correlation doesn't equal causality, because why? Because there's multiple factors in a person's death, right? I mean, there could be multiple other conditions, like, did this person have heart disease? Did this person just have a stroke, and they were, they're vaccinated on day 13, they have a heart attack on day 15, they go into a coma day 16, and they die. All right, did the vaccine cause that? It's possible. Okay, it's possible. But is there proof to establish cause and effect between those things, right? Okay, all right, this person, maybe they had high cholesterol, maybe this is their third heart attack. Every patient has a list of, or perhaps has multiple other factors that can contribute to that. So correlation does not equal causality. So in heart attack, and I give you an illustration there, the higher your bad cholesterol is, the LDL, and the lower the HDL, the good cholesterol, the greater your risk of having a heart attack. Now, this doesn't mean that everybody who has high LDL and low HDL will necessarily have a heart attack, but there is a higher risk for those that do have those factors going on with their. So probability is not the same as causality. And so correlation does not necessarily equal causality. So in induction-based studies, we look for probability-based findings without even in the absence of certainty. So drugs are approved, tests are submitted to the FDA, various trials that the drugs go through, various surveillance that goes through. That's why you may have seen in the news, Pfizer vaccine was just FDA approved yesterday. I think it was yesterday. And before that, it was emergency use authorization. So here people have been vaccinated for a long, long time, relatively speaking, in the COVID era, and it's not FDA approved. Well, finally, after a period of review of the results of the vaccine, the FDA finally gave the thumbs up, at least for Pfizer. Moderna doesn't have FDA. It still has emergency use authorization, but I imagine they're going through the FDA approval process, I would guess. I don't know. So in deduction, the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises or evidence. So an argument is valid when the conclusion follows from the premises. So we'll look, when we get over into the war and flu debate, we'll have a little bit more to say, but I've gave you some notes there on page 28, a little bit about deduction. So the conclusion necessarily follows in deduction. And we're going to talk about valid arguments and sound arguments when we get into the war and flu debate. So I'll hold off a little more on that. What we want to do is justify our truth claims. And when we just have knowledge that we hold true to according to the word of God, we want to justify that while at the same time denying error and pushing away from that as well. So again, metaphysics, there's a definition there. When we start asking metaphysical questions, what are the ultimate objective constituents of reality? Metaphysics, think of it like this: we're moving beyond, we're transcending. So physics, like the physical world, metaphysics is what transcends our world. Can we reason from creation to creator? Can we reason from design to designer? Can we reason from intelligence to a mind? So these are metaphysical moves, and there's certainly metaphysical tests that can be applied and understood. And so again, if you took a logic class or philosophy class, you would, any of you that had, maybe I had an introductory philosophy class many moons ago. And, these are some basic distinctions that are made. On page 29 and 30, and we won't spend a lot of time on that, I just wanted you to see from a language perspective, when we start talking about how do we know what we know and why do we, I wanted you to see from a biblical perspective, from the words themselves in the Greek. And I give you several Greek words there and places where you can find them. The concept of knowledge in the Bible, you could teach philosophy with the Bible because it's from God, and it comes from a mind that's reasonable, a mind that understands the difference between probability and certainty, a mind that understands that we live in this veil of soul making, where we are limited in our understanding, and we have just a short number of years to connect with the true God of heaven, and then we fly away. And so you could look at this and study it on your own. I won't take time to do it tonight. I want to spend the rest of the time tonight in looking at a book, and it's a video too. I didn't go into playing portions of the video tonight. Just if we tried, there could be audio issues, and trying to make sure that the people online are hearing the audio. And then if there's responses to certain videos and segments, it become an issue. So I just want to point out, and it's in the notes, if you look on page 31, you can go and watch this debate for free. I would encourage you to. It's a time investment. It's probably 6 hours of time, but you could take it in bite-sized portions. And what's interesting, though, is these are two very well respected voices in their field of philosophy. So you take Thomas Warren at that point in his life. Here he is. He's got a PhD from Vanderbilt, very astute. He had served in the military, World War II, if I'm not mistaken. Very bright. He almost had a career as a cartoonist. He's quite an impressive artist. But he went on and he got his PhD in philosophy from Vanderbilt. And he studies in his thesis on that. He deals with this philosopher, this Australian philosopher by the name of Mackey. J.L. Mackey is his name. And J.L. Mackey was advancing an argument in Warren's day that tried to advance the notion that there's this incompatibility in God's nature between his power and his love, and the fact that evil exists. And so Warren writes his dissertation on the problem that Mackey has given, and the roots in Mackey. And so he's written in So he took his PhD dissertation, ended up publishing a book, Have the Atheists Prove There Is No God. It's a little short, little orange book, maybe 100-ish pages, not very long. Technical though. He's a philosopher and he's making an argument. And arguments for a philosopher.
Somebody else.
Thank you, sir. All right, so these are two very accomplished in their field, if you were. Anthony Flew was the other constituent in this debate. So Flew was from England, and in his day, he was kind of like the Richard Dawkinses of our day. He was very, published in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, trying to get agnostics to get off the fence, become an atheist, saying that we don't have really good reasons for belief in God. So Warren was at these philosophical conferences. He's reading the literature in philosophy, and he's hearing what these people were saying. And remember in the 70s that there is this hotbed of discussion about atheism and agnosticism. Well, Warren challenges, and I forget who challenged who. They ended up having this debate in Texas. You can go online and watch it. It's interesting. Flew has a nice British accent. Flew is cordial. He's not, there's not as many quotes, bites from Flew that are, polarizing in the sense that all theists are Dawkins gives you a lot of, there's a lot of polarization that goes on with Dawkins. He thinks that it's evil what religion does to society. But here in this day and time, this debate, and the reason why I spend the time that I do now, when I taught this class at the Florida School of Preaching, this was a required book. And for two weeks, the class would go through this video, go through this book, and I had a slew of questions from this debate because I wanted them to hit the high points, because what Warren does in this debate, it's 4 nights. Again, it's about 6 hours. And what you see in the debate is Flew will take the affirmative. That is, he'll take the affirmative. I know that God does not exist. All right. So on Monday night of that debate, he'll have 3 affirmative speeches. Warren then will, after each affirmative speech, get up in the debate and give Warren's first negative. So Warren will be denying the claim that Flew is affirming. Flew is affirming that God does not exist. And then on Wednesday night, it kind of flip-flops. So it flip-flops in the sense that then Warren takes the affirmative. I know that God exists. So he's obligated in the formal debate to prove that God does exist. That's the obligation. Well, then Flew that night on Wednesday night, then he takes the negative, right? 3 negative speeches, 3 affirmative speeches. And then Warren, the end of Wednesday night, has a rejoinder, which is a short speech. So this happens each night. And what you see is 2 very well-respected with opposing beliefs, right? Opposing beliefs. One's an atheist, so he claims not to believe. What you see is very respected individuals discussing this all-important issue. The reason why I had the students in Florida do it when I taught Christian evidences there was because it's a real-world exchange, and they hit on so many issues in a short period of time. It's like the summary of my whole class, the things that I want to get at in just, 4 nights. And so I'm going to share with you some notes from that. And that's what these are here from that debate. So you don't have to, if you're not taking this for credit, of course, if you are taking it for credit, you can watch the Warren and Flew debate and evaluate it. That's a little longer than a 2-hour movie, but it's definitely worth your time. And if you're not taking it, this class for credit, I would highly encourage you to watch it. Again, it's for free. It's better than what's on Netflix. It's got so much good teaching. And what you see is, all right, okay, what's the best? Let's be open to this, right? Like, what's the best that the atheist has to throw at biblical theism? All right, so then you watch the video. And here, all right, Anthony Flew is talking about the abominable snowman. Warren is not being disrespectful towards that notion, but he's putting God in that same camp, right? He's putting God in the same thing as a centaur. And you see, how Warren responds to those things. And so Warren is he's passionate in his beliefs, but in this day and age, and I'll just say this and move on. There's so many layers sometimes of this cordiality between disagreeing parties. It's like we got to hug and shake hands and tell each other how great we are, but really we're worlds apart, right? I mean, let's not, in our world, in this postmodern era where, everybody's belief matters, everybody needs to have a voice. And in that day and age, Warren said, all right, you're telling the world God does not exist, and I'm going to hold you to the fire with your claims. You've written it in literature. I've read your books. We've reviewed your books. He's asking, Warren did in preparation for some of these debates, he would ask other preachers to read, and he wanted to make sure that when he went into the debate, he was prepared. Now, he was a philosophy professor, right? And very, very bright, but he also knew that he wasn't omniscient, right? And he didn't, just because he had been through an intense program of study, didn't mean that Flew wouldn't catch him with the curveball. And so he prepared in a tremendous way for these encounters, not because he was trying to make Flew out to be, he was attacking the principle, right? He was attacking the notion. Okay, you said God does not exist. Now, in a philosophical argument, you're going to have to demonstrate those things. So it's philosopher and philosopher, like they're both very well studied in logic, right? They're both very well studied at drawing conclusions that are based on the evidence. Now, Flew, you've signed up for this debate, not for agnosticism. When you move from atheism to agnosticism, you've admitted defeat in this debate. Now, that's the position that Warren's going to hold him to. If you move from atheism to agnosticism, you've signed up saying you affirm that God does not exist. Sherry? Okay. Right. He respected him as a person. He respected Flew. He loved his soul. He engaged in him in this debate. He would have loved to have won his soul, who would have loved for the gospel to have won his soul. And so it wasn't but there is passion in the delivery. And also, one of the reasons why I have the students go through this is because sometimes the technicality of two philosophers and, they're laying out silly, Warren kept pushing both Mattson and Flew, like, all right, give me your argument. Like, lay out your argument. You're saying, God, lay it out. And let me poke holes in it, right? That's what he wanted him to do. So I want to share with you tonight, and look on page 32. Again, so the proposition is the existence of God. I know that God does not exist. That's the affirmative that Flew begins night one on. And so I want us to see here in reading and watching this debate, here's the basis. So what's the best that the atheist has to offer when it comes to arguing that God does not exist? Now, Fluid published a lot on this notion of falsifiability. That is, how do you prove that something is not the case? So he puts God in that box, if you will, of not being the case. Well, what are the grounds? Well, one is based upon the grounds of relevancy. So he would say, when we say that something is not possible, he would object to the existence of God based upon relevancy. So he considers an abominable snowman, a Loch Ness monster, and wolves in Manitoba. Some people, he would say, either believe or claim to know that there are such, but this belief is false or rubbish, according to Flew. And there's no evidence yet for an abominable snowman or a Loch Ness monster, but yet people will subscribe to that view or that notion. He's not saying that these notions are impossible. Flew's not saying that they're impossible, but he's saying as a matter of falsification, in other words, as a matter of proof, that we don't have evidence to establish them. And he puts God in that category. We don't have evidence to establish God. So then the next two cases he talks about is God is impossible in his estimation as a matter of a biological fact. So he asserts that denying God is rooted in a violation of biological laws. So he considers for the moment a centaur. We don't talk a whole lot about centaurs, but centaurs are these fictional creatures that are half man, half horse, or half woman, half horse. And he says that we know that these do not exist because biology has told us that there's no such thing. So he dismisses God as a matter of scientific fact. And so this is the argument that he's making. And then thirdly, he would say that God does not exist as a matter of logical impossibility based upon certain incoherent characteristics of God's nature. And so he would say that like there are no round squares, like there are no unmarried husbands, like there are no automobiles that are smaller outside than the inside, like there's no such thing as a 90-year-old teenager. He would object to God based upon the God in his estimation. Again, I'm not saying this is the case. I'm saying this is what he's saying. He's saying that God, the concept of biblical theism, involves logical contradictions. Well, what are those contradictions? Well, they would say that evil, the existence of evil, is incompatible with either God's power. That is, if evil exists, God should exercise his power to put down evil and put down evil completely and to eliminate all suffering that is the consequence of evil in our world. And if God doesn't, then certainly a concept of a God like that cannot exist. So that's one ground. And then the other grounds that they'll say is that if God is all loving, certainly an all-loving God would not allow evil to exist. And since evil exists, it's incompatible with love. So suffering and love. So Warren, in his book, goes to a great length, and in this debate, he'll discuss how those aren't necessarily incompatible.
I want very necessarily taking us to a couple of
That's a good point. Good illustration, Sherry. The lady is upset and says, where was your God when my son died? And the preacher responds, the same place that when God's son died. So God understands laws and understands suffering. He came to this world to suffer and die. gave up the glory, emptied himself, taking upon himself the form of a man. So this idea of incoherence is something that's advanced by Flew as well. Then another one, it's impossible as a matter of testing. That is, that he's saying that we can't test certain religious propositions. And he talks about prayer being one of those things. And so he says that he denies the existence of God based upon God can't be tested or tried in that sense, that whether we could know by other testing methods, and since God can't be tested like we test other things or test things in science of that nature for repeatability and accuracy and things like that, therefore he would argue that God does not exist. So later in the debate, there's more that comes out, but these are the kind of the four basic advancements that Flew's going to stand on throughout the debate. And when you watch the debate, you kind of have to dig, or you read the debate, you kind of have to dig to figure out, okay, like, all right, like, where's the argument? Where is he just said a lot of things. Where's the argument in that? Like, where is the proposition? Where's the statement that it's either true or false, right? And it's definitely worth watching, but I try to distill some of this information for you. Warren says these are the consequences if atheism are true. Bottom of page 32. If atheism is true, during our lives here on earth, we are nothing but organized matter. Our creator has been rocks and dirt. He says there's no real objective right or wrong, good or evil, and no one has any real obligations to do anything or not to do anything. He would say that physical death is the absolute end to each and every one of us, that our total being will go to the dust of the earth, and no matter how we may have acted, whether we've murdered people like the Nazis, or whether we've lied or stole or raped, there'll be absolutely no accounting, no judgment, no punishment. That's the implications if atheism is true. Now, one of the things that's fascinating in this debate is at the very end of this book, what they agreed to, what Warren and Flew agreed to in this debate, is they agreed each night to give each other 10 questions. And so prior to this debate, Warren would give Flew 10 questions, and then in the discussion that night in the debate, he would use those answers to these questions in his various speeches. And so Flew had the chance to give Warren answers. Flew had the opportunity to give Warren questions. Warren had opportunity to give Flew questions. But you see Flew's handwriting to these issues. And it's fascinating because Warren's reading his response, like, here's this teacher that's used to grading papers, but he's grading like one of the world's foremost atheists. And you see Warren as he's writing in brackets, almost like he's a student in a class saying, whoa, time out. Like, you're an expert supposed to be an expert in atheism, and this is how you're answering these questions. So it's fascinating to at the end of that book, you can see those things as well. There was a comment here that might be helpful. Sister Ruth Rosario pointed out, for those of you that are in class, this might be helpful to you. There is a free PDF copy, she says, of Darwin on Trial, and she gave a web link to it. And for those who are in class tonight, here's the web address. It's Max. You're writing down here, maxddl.org. That's maxddl.org. She says there's a free copy of Darwin on Trial. That's that Philip Johnson book I referenced earlier. So thank you, Ruth, for sharing that with us. For those that are in class tonight, if you want to read that or get your hands on it, it's a rich book. So so Warren would then go on. The consequences, if theism is true, we know we have a creator. There's real objective right and wrong, good and evil. We have real obligation to obey the will of God, and each of us will live on after this life is over. Each of us will give an account of how we live. So this is the consequences if theism is true. Now, one of the things that Flew does, and you can see on your, Warren does in arguing the case. Remember, these guys are arguing a case. It's not merely a friendly kind of let's just toss out some notions here, guys. Like, they have the obligation in a formal debate to prove the proposition that they're standing by. And so Warren sets forward. Sorry if you're online. Okay, thank you. All right, so Flew's prison here. So remember, Warren was a cartoonist. So he this is pre-PowerPoint days. He does some tremendous illustrations in this book. I share some of them with you in the notes there. But he says Flew is inside the middle of this prison. And in the middle of this prison, Warren makes the case that Flew is inside of it. And there's walls, barriers that Flew has to prove, of which he cannot prove or does not prove, to establish the case that God does not exist. So Flew's inside the middle of this prison. Well, what does Flew assume or argue that he doesn't, or what are the weaknesses of his argument? Here is what Warren says. Flew is in the middle of this prison, and Flew must be able to prove that matter is eternal. All right. You're saying you know that God does not exist, yet as a philosopher, you know that matter is real. So if you were to read in Graceful Reason here, there is on page, for some of you who are taking the class for credit, on chapter 6, page 113, there's an argument for God's existence based upon contingency. Now, what that means is that every being that exists, all right, is either a contingent being or a non-contingent being. What's that mean? Well, a non-contingent being is a being that is dependent on another for its existence. So you take Jackson and Drew, right? They're contingent upon Katrina and I for their existence. You take Daniel, I'm contingent upon my parents for my existence. Okay, and we can go back, right? But philosophers know that you can't go back infinitely. At some point in time, there was first a baby or first a human. Yeah, exactly. So the principle of contingency says that there can't be an infinite regression, if you will, back to in a series, if you will. And so this whole notion of matter being eternal, Flew's not going to deny that matter exists, right? So it's either the case, right, that matter is eternal or it's not. Can't be both. So Flew, you're saying you know that God does not exist, that since matter exists, prove that it's always has existed. So the burden of proof is put in Flew's lap to establish that case, right? He didn't sign up for the debate saying that I think it's possible that God does not exist. He says, I know, right? So if you know, Flew, you've got to establish, since matter exists, that matter has always been. Now, how are you going to do it? Right? How are you going to prove that to be the case? So each of these are boxes. And so the next one, life arose from rocks and dirt. All right. So, today we would probably say it a little differently, but, he's arguing the point of contingency. And that is the notion that there is a dependent aspect to, if matter first exists, and we're going to argue from an evolutionary perspective, at some point, the unliving, right, the non-living became living. That's what you're philosophically committed to, Flu. If you're going to say that evolution is how we arose here, philosophically, you're committed to the notion that life came from non-life. Prove it, right? Prove it. That's what he's saying. He's saying you signed up for that. Here's a prison that you're in. All right. What's the next one? Consciousness came from that which had no consciousness. So consciousness there has to do with self-awareness. All right. At some point in time, Flu, in the back in our history, that which had no self-awareness became self-aware. When was that? Prove it, right? It's not enough. We're not just postulating ideas here. We're not just tossing out notions. We're not just considering some options or some possibilities. You signed up for the notion, God does not exist. Now, I want you, and this is what Warren keeps doing to Flu, is he's saying you need to establish your philosophical commitments in evidence, in proof. So he's going to keep pushing, right, at Flu to do that. That conscience came from that which has no conscience. So conscience is this ability to discern right and wrong. So you're saying that which possesses no morality at some point in time became aware of that which was moral. That's your commitment in atheism, in denying the existence of God. You're saying that some point in humanity's history, morality came into existence from that which had no morals. So it's not enough, Flu, to say, well, here's some different notions, here's some ideas. This is your prison. So he's holding Flu's commitments, philosophical commitments to the test. Intelligence came from that which has no intelligence. So here's another aspect of Flu's prison. So these are commitments that are the implications of holding to atheism. And you know what? It's just as true in 2021 for atheists and agnostics who say, well, I don't think there's evidence out there to prove that God exists. Okay. All right. So where's your information? Where's your evidence that life came from non-life? Where's your evidence that intelligence came from that which has no intelligence? Where's your evidence that that which is moral came from that which has no morality? At some point in time, right? So you want to say, well, let's give it millions or 14.6 billion years. And then, it's not a point in time. Well, the philosopher says, well, it is a point in time. Even if the philosopher grants, right, 14.6 billion years, the philosopher says at some point in time, that which was not moral became moral. That which was not intelligent became intelligent. That which has no consciousness, self-awareness became self-aware. That which has no morality became moral. So the philosopher, Warren, is saying, hey, set forth your proof. You're committed to this. And so in the negative, he says, all right, Flu, break out of these walls and break out of this prison. So if you turn over to page 34 and well, let's look at the bottom of 33 for just a moment. One of the things that Warren is interested in discussing with Flu is the nature of morality and ethics. And so he asked them these questions. Did value did not exist before the first human being, true or false? So he puts it in a true or false way, a true or false question. And then he wants to see, a true or false question makes a person or tries to encourage a person to make an either or choice. So Flew could write out to the side of these true or false questions if he considered a third option. But, you know, he's trying to get Flew, in Flew's beliefs, you know, Flew takes this notion that at some point in time, value kind of came into being. When? Flew, where? How did that happen? Did value exist before the first human being? In other words, Warren is trying to push Flew on this issue. Is morality and ethics merely the product of a human mind? So what Warren is going to work into in this debate is there a morality that's objective, that rules England's behavior, rules the US's behavior, rules Germany's behavior, rules, you know, everybody's behavior? Is there an objective frame of reference? You know, are you committed that morality is the product of a human mind? So, you know, Warren's going to address that. There's on the middle of page 34, there's something called the Euthyphro dilemma. And I'll let you read a little bit more about that. You may come across this in some of your reading. If you read in apologetics, or you may hear this mentioned from time to time. And this Euthyphro dilemma is something that Flew appeals to in one of his speeches. And it's this notion about God and goodness. So here's how they frame the dilemma. Is an action good because God approves of it? Is an action good because God approves of it? In other words, God, you know, says to love your neighbor, right? Do good to your enemy. All right. Is that good because God approves of it? Or does God approve of the action because the action is good? Now, what the Euthyphro dilemma is, what those who say that it offers a proper dilemma is that you have a standard of goodness that either stands over God, right? You have a standard of goodness that's judging God's morality, God's character, God's goodness, or, right, you have a standard that is the product of God. And in that standard that is the product of God, there is this arbitrary nature of that standard. So those are some of the outworkings of the Euthyphro dilemma. In other words, if God said X is good, therefore X is good. And so what you do is you have the being of God somehow separated from the will of God. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, there is this conceptual distinction that's going on with Euthyphro. This is an issue that if you go back and read in philosophy, this Euthyphro dilemma, I forget how long ago it dates. Oh, it's with Plato. So we're going back maybe 600 BC, I think, somewhere in there. So, you know, this would offer a proper dilemma if there were only two options, but there are more than just two options in this. The notion is if God approves of it because it's good, then there's a law above God. That is, you have some goodness that God himself is abiding by and he's according his life to. Given this view, goodness is above God and there's a goodness higher than God. If an act is right because God approves of it, I'm on C.2 here, number 7, then goodness is arbitrary. Goodness becomes whatever God wants it to be. The argument is that God could have just as easily said that lying, murder, and rape are good. Given this view, law is arbitrarily beneath God. Well, the way that you answer that, and this has been answered by multiple people, but this is one that Flew goes to. The way that you answer that is in discussing something, and we'll end on this because it's kind of hurts my head. In discussing something, there are what are called concepts, right? So conceptually, we sometimes distinguish the goodness of God from the being of God, right? So we sometimes conceptually distinguish the being of God from the law of God or the will of God, right? And so those concepts we may discuss in distinct categories, so to speak. But in reality, there is a unity and a oneness between the identity of God, the nature of God, the being of God, the person of God, the essence of God, and the will of God that cannot be distinguished. In fact, goodness flows from the very essence of God himself. So what philosophers sometimes do is they'll break up the categorical concepts as if they are categorically distinct and create some alleged dilemma. Goodness actually flows from God's very nature. God's law flows from his identity, right? Look at John 12. So it'd help if I'm in 12. So in John chapter 12, verse 47, if anyone hears my word and does not keep them, I do not judge him, for I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. The one who rejects me and does not receive my words has a judge. The word that I have spoken will judge him on the last day. So can we conceptually distinguish the person of Christ from his words? Well, Jesus is more than his speech, right? I mean, Jesus existed in a bodily form. He existed in the flesh. He was spirit and flesh. He was embodied. He did come from heaven. He was virgin born. All of these describe physical and spiritual characteristics of Jesus. But his word, right? To reject his word is to reject him. You see that? To reject Jesus's word is to reject him. So you reject the person of Christ when you reject the word of Christ. So Jesus here in inspired teaching shows a connection between the identity of God and the word from God and the message from God. And so we can't say, you won't be able to say in the last day, well, I just rejected what you said. I just rejected what you said. I didn't really reject you. Right? I just rejected what you said. You won't be able to say that. To reject what Jesus said is to reject him. So there's this connection between the goodness of God and the ontology, that's the fancy philosophical term, the being of God, the essence of God, the nature of God. And you might distinguish those in concept, but in reality, goodness flows from him. Goodness isn't over him. Goodness isn't arbitrarily beneath him. Goodness flows from him. So that's kind of a basic description of that. And Lord willing, next Tuesday, we'll pick up. But if you have time between now and next week, if you want to buy this book, by the way, go to the Warren Apologetics Center and you can purchase this book and they'll ship it to you. Probably have it before next week. They're pretty fast in their shipping and stuff. And so I would encourage you, if you don't want to spend, if you don't want to spend the money for the book, go online and watch it. And these notes will make a lot more sense, I hope. I just find that it's such a great summary of this class that I want you to have it. Appreciate you being here tonight. Any comments online? I appreciate you guys listening in. And thank you for watching. And I hope that you find the information helpful. I hope that you're learning that we've had some good discussion tonight. So I know that those here in person are listening and they like the study too, I think. So thank you for being here. I know it's a Tuesday night and you could be sleeping or doing something else, but thank you for being here. And it's encouraging to me to engage with you, and I hope that you're enjoying the study as well. Let's end with a prayer. Father, we come before you tonight, thankful for your word. We're thankful that we can know that you exist. May our lives ever show the world that we believe it, that we love you, and that we'll scream your truths from the highest mountain and teach of them in the quietest corners of our world. We're thankful for Christ and his death for our sins. We pray that we'll always love him and love our neighbor as you want us to. Help us to model our life after Christ, and help us to seek your truth passionately, and help us to share your truth with other people that they may believe and know Jesus, our only Savior. Be with us in all things. Be with the sick. Be with those that have procedures coming soon. Be with those that are bereaving. Be with those that are wrestling with all the different aspects of COVID. We pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.